I like your nurse's uniform, guy.
These are OR scrubs.
Oh, are they?
All right, so we're talking about the one and only Wes Anderson. Hi, this is Karan from San Francisco.
This is Alex from Los Angeles, and welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We are two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but we're both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In this episode, we'll cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of film, and Karan, you already said it, it is Wes Anderson. For me, he is not only one of my favorite directors currently, like I will see every single one of his films in theaters.
Hmm.
And he actually has a new short coming out, which is why we're dropping this episode now. That's coming to Netflix, but I think it's also getting a limited theatrical release, probably like a New York, LA type deal. But I've loved Wes Anderson since I was in high school. Since seeing Rushmore for the first time, it really struck a chord to me, meant a lot to me. We actually covered it in our episode 24 episodes on school experience. So we can
Hmm.
hear more of our take on that when it came to school. But the movie really connected with me. And from then on, I'm like, who is this director? I want to watch all of his films. Oh, he's only done one other thing. Oh, okay. And then I follow his career going forward. Because this is right at the beginning of his career. And for me, too, just in the process of discovering my love of film around that time as well. I was in high school, late 90s. That was when I was really becoming obsessed with like the art of film and going back and watching old movies and really understanding, I think, he was one of the first directors I really understood, I think, what a director does. The directors can have a signature style and a signature mark
Mm.
because it was so visual. I mean, to be honest, probably the first director I felt that way about was Tim Burton, because again, it's very obvious to see. And as a child, sort of understanding like what a director is, you don't really know.
Hmm.
And it's hard to kind of tell the theme of Martin Scorsese movies feel a certain way. Like if you're 10, you're not going to understand that, but you can visually see when directors have unique visual styles. Oh, this looks like that director. And for me, definitely Wes Anderson had a very unique visual style. It became more unique as his career went on. But even in Rushmore, it looked very different, and that was felt fresh and new. And to me, I was like, who is this? It must be the director. And then that started a lot for me, and I've loved him and his films ever since. And what about you? What's your relationship with Wes and his films?
Yeah, very similar with kind of the signature style, but I came to him very late in life. I think the first movie that I saw that made a huge impact on me was actually Grand Budapest, because
Hmm.
as listeners know, like I moved to the US later in life and had to sort of play a lot of catch up. So I watched that movie and was blown away by its artistry and how sort of lighthearted and fun it was, but also this ability to deal with darker themes. And that's been a constant in Wes's movies.
Mm-hmm.
Your mileage might vary on that. And he also plays with the degree of kind of gray and dark that exists in his movies. But I found that very interesting. And then, of course, I went back and watched all of his stuff. And since then, I've been following his career, will watch everything and anything that he does. So, yeah, I am very excited to get into his filmography.
Yeah, no, me too. I think he's been not only influential, sounds like for the two of us, but he definitely is one of the few directors nowadays that I think has such a unique style that he's
Hmm.
a brand in and of himself. I mean, it's
Yep.
not to the level in terms of commercial success of like a James Cameron or Christopher Nolan, but people know Wes Anderson, and you can meme. There's all these things going around
I
TikTok and
know.
with the AI generation things, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in the episode. But I think he's a rare that he is an independent filmmaker who's made mainly small films without a gigantic financial success on the level of like what Christopher Nolan or Steven Spielberg has done. But people know his name. If you go to outside of the movie communities, people still know what Wes Anderson is. It would probably be
Yep.
able to recognize his visual style. And I think that speaks a lot to his uniqueness as an artist, that he is so parodied in the way that he is. Maybe you can argue for better or for worse, but I think that's what makes him so unique. That yeah, you can parody him, but that essence of really what he is as a filmmaker, which you touched on, it's a lot of very serious and adult themes wrapped around something that seems on its surface to be very pleasant and cookie cutter, maybe childlike in a way or
Yeah.
whimsical. Yeah, that's there, but underneath it is a lot more complicated issues, and that's just potentially how he deals with those issues in his own life. He has to wrap them up in this
Hmm.
this this very controlled world, because perhaps too he is so obsessed with art design, camera control, all these things that I love about his work, but he's wrapping those under around emotions that you really can't control. So
Yeah.
he's trying to get control out of everything that he can, because the heart of his movies are about things that you have no control over, which are your feelings, how other people feel about you, how you feel about them, and all the hard and difficult things that life has in store. But
Yeah.
but he's a control freak, so he has to try to do as much as he can, and maybe that's sort of the essence of why his movies look a certain way, but they feel kind of completely different.
Yeah, no, totally. Couldn't have said it better. I will say though, from a commercial standpoint, like given his, size and scope and scale of movie making, like I think he's actually done fairly well even commercially. Like,
Sure. Right,
like
right.
these movies, they end up making like a decent amount of money, even in today's climate where it's so hard to, get folks to the theater if it's not like a big budget giant movie, although hopefully that changes after this year.
Right. I mean, I meant more along the lines of he hasn't had his, like, again, for Christopher Nolan, it would be like The Dark Knight,
Yeah.
or
But he's
Tim
not
Burton
seeking
even. But
that.
fair enough. Right.
Yeah.
No, he definitely is not. I'm sure
No.
he could if he wanted to just
Yeah.
go in and pick up any movie, but that's not his style. So I just meant in terms of that blockbuster success. Obviously, for what
Right.
the world he's in, I mean, he is definitely one of the most successful independent filmmakers, and in
Yeah.
terms of his budget size versus what he returns at the
Yeah.
box office. He's a great track record, which is probably why he's able to keep working the
Right.
way that he is, because his financiers know that they'll probably get a good return on their investment.
Yeah.
Okay, so to jump into his filmography, then the first three of his films, which were Bottle Rocket, Rushmore, and Royal Tenenbaums, I do think is definitely his beginning phase. I mean, this is
Right.
where he was first getting his name out there, honing his style, and becoming an art house darling, I think is the best way to put it. And Bottle Rocket was based on a short film that he did, actually, that I've also seen, that also a movie that we covered in our Meet Cute episode, which was episode 33. So we've covered Bottle Rocket. This film I did not see until I first saw Rushmore. I went back and watched Bottle Rocket, and like I said in that episode, I find it incredibly charming, moving, fun. There's definitely a unique style there, but it's not as much of that dollhouse style and aesthetic that we'll even find in Rushmore. But I think this film is still easily one of my favorites of his, top three, probably, for me. I just love this film. What anything else you want to touch on with Bottle Rocket? Like, when you just do you see this chronologically? Like, you went back after Budapest and started at the beginning? Oh, that's cool. So you can see his style evolve.
Yeah, started with Bottle Rocket and sort of worked my way up. But one could argue that these earlier movies, especially Bottle Rocket and Rushmore, are maybe the most pure form of his storytelling, because the storytelling is not totally taken over by the visual aesthetic. And as we talk further, we'll see there are obviously examples of when those two are in total harmony, but in this case it's very much about those sort of themes of broken relationships and complicated people who are unable to express their emotions really well, and they're dealing through all of that. And there is some sort of, I wouldn't use the word hijinks, but there's some sort of like larger than life kind of quirky situation at play. And maybe that is the artifice, as opposed to the Russian doll visual aesthetic, that helps him kind of navigate these characters and these emotions. But they just hit a lot stronger because they're pure, they're just out there. But at the same time, like the sophistication of how they're put together, the performances and the screenplay, like you can't tell like this is like a young filmmaker making his first movies. Like they feel like these two movies in particular would be, no pun intended, at the Rushmore of most directors who've had like a 40-year career. And he just right out of the gate is sort of so clear in what he's trying to say.
Yes, no, definitely. It's very unique for a filmmaker to come out with such a strong vision, especially Rushmore and then Royal Tenenbaums, the next film that he made, are really very, very distinct. I mean, Rushmore, there's, curtains closing over the screen during the different acts. There's very, very controlled camera movements in that film. But then also that unique quirkiness, like you mentioned, in Rushmore, he's putting together these plays that are, in a grade school, but woefully like inappropriate in terms of the type of stuff that they're dealing with. But again, that's also a sort of a child's attempt to operate in an adult world. I mean, that's a lot of what that movie is about, and that works so well. And the other thing I love about these first three films too, are the needle drops that he's able to do,
Oh,
and the use
yeah.
of pop songs and existing music material. I mean, Rushmore has some of my favorite needle drops in any film, and also Royal Tenenbaums. I mean, starting off with that version of Hey Jude is just
Yeah.
really, really powerful and incredible. And I like later on in his career when he, started working a lot more with like Alexander Desplat, and his movies now don't feature needle drops anymore. They're very much about the score. But I honestly miss this period of his career where he just was so excellent at getting an incredible soundtrack to accompany the film. I mean, I bought every single one of these first three movies. I had all their soundtracks and would listen to them a lot, through college and things, because they just remind me of the film, but they're also a great collection of very
Hmm.
eccentric music. There was a lot of, 60s, 70s, which I was listening to anyway, but they're more niche type of songs and artists that it was just fantastic. And I really kind of missed that part of his career. And one thing I'll mention too, before we kind of move on to the next phase, is something I brought up. I think I can't remember if this was in our Rushmore episode or the Royal Tenenbaums, which you talked about in episode 29, which is our family episode. These three films Wes co-wrote with Owen Wilson.
Mm.
And he never came back. He has not yet come back to work with Owen as a screenwriter. And I feel that there is a sort of a heart and extra
Yeah. A
emotion
sweetness.
and a sweetness that is woven into these films, which never really came back in any of his other films in this certain way. And then also, I think there's an element of the damage potentially that damaged characters even more so in these three movies than a lot of the rest of his career, I find. And I feel that I don't know exactly what Owen contributes in terms of the specific lines or story structure. I've never dug into that necessarily in the making of these films, but I do find the work that Wes did with Owen in terms of the screenwriting to be the strongest of his career so far. At least I just think they had a special pairing there and a bond as artists that I kind of wish he would go back and work with Owen at some point in the future. Maybe he will. We never know.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. There's like a tenderness to it. As we go further, I will say I think there's some other gems that come along the way as well. But yeah, this is a pretty special relationship. The other thing I would call out here also is that you see his evolution in these three movies from working with, lesser known actors
Mm-hmm.
like the Owen Wilson and his brother to industry titans like Gene Hackman and Angelica Houston and
Danny
such in Royal
Glover, yeah.
Tenenbaums. And I
Mm-hmm.
love that progression as well. Like it's the same pure damage people character relationships, but you see like a elevation in the product that he's put out there in Royal Tenenbaums because he has amazing actors that play and also a larger ensemble, something that we see a lot more of as his career kind of progresses, because the first two movies are a lot more contained in terms of its
Mm-hmm.
principal characters.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great. I love seeing that. And then we can't start a Wes Anderson filmography not mention Bill Murray, who's
Yes.
kind of a signature mainstay from pretty much the get-go. And it's so interesting. I don't even know the backstory of how they found each other, but it sort of feels like that Bill Murray in my head is kind of this encapsulation of quirky, slightly prickly or a lot prickly, a little bit irritating, but also charming and lovable. All of that is encapsulated in the Bill Murray persona, which to me is sort of the distillation of Wes Anderson's work.
No, definitely great call. I mean, James Caan was in Bottle Rocket, but it was a different coup, I guess, in terms of getting Bill Murray, who at the time was in a career doldrums. And
Mhm.
this movie actually in its performance in Rushmore, I think, shifted his entire career to this
Yeah,
wholly different path after trying to be in broad comedies in the mid to early to mid 90s. So it also changed his career. And I think because of the accolades that Murray got for that performance, that led Wes potentially to be able to snag like a Gene Hackman or an Angelica Houston
right.
or these other in Titans, because they saw, oh wow, this guy can get great performances out of actors as successful as Bill Murray. So moving then on to the next phase, I feel it should be like Life Aquatic and Darjeeling. Those two seem to me that very paired together, not only kind of in
Hmm.
themes, but also in terms of like artistic success. So I remember actually seeing Steve Zissou like opening night. It was actually a early screening at the Egyptian Theater. It was like a huge Wes Anderson fan, like everyone is. And it was like oh my God, what is he going to do after Tenenbaums? And it was
Mm.
definitely a major feeling of disappointment in the audience after Zissou. the movie actually underperformed. We talked about budgets. This is his biggest budget ever, and he did not able to return what I think the investors thought after Royal Tenenbaums was such a giant hit at the box office and also with awards. So Zissou really, I think, put Wes Anderson on a back foot, and a lot of talk at the time was too busy, too overextended, too much, no heart there, something's missing. And I think that, made him scale everything back a lot for Darjeeling Limited, which is a more straightforward type of narrative, visual style, back to the only, like you said, there's no more ensemble anymore. It's really just three characters and brothers and how they relate, as opposed to what he was trying to do with Zissou, is paint this giant world. So I feel like this was a period of humbling for him, even though I do like both films. I like Darjeeling a lot more. We touched on that film in episode 16, our travel episode. Zissou, I still am disappointed in it every time I go back to it. I'm hoping that maybe this is the time that the movie will work a little bit more for me, but I think it's mixed success. So what about you? What were your thoughts, having not gone through this at the time? So at the time, just can imagine like, oh my God, this is like the next best director of all time. And then Steve Zissou comes out and it's just like, oh, maybe this guy was just a flash in the pan.
Yes, I have not been able to finish Zissou. I just
speaks for itself, then, huh?
Yeah, I just got so bored.
Yeah.
And I want to give another shot. And I will say that you can start to see like the development of the great art design and,
yes.
all of that is starting to come to life, which we see in the rest of his career. So in that sense, it is pivotal because you don't see much of that in the first three movies. So,
right.
But in terms of like storytelling and like you said, the heart is gone. There's also something very dark in these movies. And I wonder how much of that is that when you get success so early on and then the world is expecting, all these great things from you and now you have to recreate it. And what does that pressure make you do? It sort of feels like a product of that a little bit. The other thing also is this the time when Noah Baumbach joined him?
Yes, Noah joined him for Life Aquatic. He was not involved in Darjeeling. That was Coppola and Jason Schwartzman. So Roman Coppola and Schwartzman wrote that one with him. But yeah, Baumbach joined him on Steve Zissou, and I think that does just change something about the Wes Anderson dynamic. Bringing Noah in,
because he's definitely a much more darker themed filmmaker who I really enjoy for his movies himself. But I think this partnership is maybe not the most successful, at least this time around. But I can imagine, right? Like you're sort of the indie world's darling, and we love to kind of put up our heroes, and it must be a tough spot to be in to follow up something like Royal Tenenbaums. But I'm so glad that post Darjeeling Limited, he starts to kind of come back to what we love him for, even though those two movies, obviously, I'm sure they have their fans and they're
I like
pivotal.
Darjeeling. I'll stand up for that one. But
it grew on me after we watched it for our episode. I kind of want to go back and watch it again.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that with Zissou, just in terms of like the pressures and everything, because actually the film is in a way about that too. Like the main character is a filmmaker who's under a lot of pressure to make another film, even though I didn't even think about this. His sort of old friend who he used to make movies with died with a shark attack, and now he's no longer working with Owen Wilson. I wonder if he's wrapping that into it. Now he's off on his own doing something, and does he live up to the expectations? So I'm wondering if the movie sort of is set up to fail. It's sort of like in a meta comment on where he is in his career. I think that's a really good point. You brought that up, that he had all those expectations. Maybe that was what he was putting into the work and that pressure. And
maybe I should watch it with that context now. Maybe I like it better.
Yeah. Well, then we're moving on. So, Darjeeling was, again, a limited success commercially and critically, but definitely recovered from the disappointment in Zissou. And then we have Fantastic Mr. Fox, Moonrise Kingdom, Grand Budapest Hotel. I feel like that's kind of the next phase, which is him coming back to both critical and box office acclaim. And also the films are much, much stronger than that last period. So just the Mr. Fox we talked about in our fall episode 25, his first time working in stop motion animation, which, he's so controlling anyway with these live action. It's just amazing to see him when he literally can control everything about the world. And as we said in that episode, I love Fantastic Mr. Fox. Every time I watch it, it gets better and better. And I'm glad he's done a couple animated films, or one animated film since, and actually has a couple more shorts coming up. And I love when he works in animation, and I'm very excited to see how those work out. But that to me in this period, I think is my my favorite, though I do really like Grand Budapest Hotel a lot too. I think that's, I somewhat argue it's his masterpiece. I prefer the Rushmores and Tenenbaums of the world, but that film to me is also just incredible and gets better each time I see it. And so this would have been the phase you came in on him in terms of real
Yeah.
time. What were your thoughts on these films?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we talked in our episode as well, but like this kind of animation and storytelling, and once again, he's dealing with, complex themes of what is it to be a man? What is
Yes.
it to grow up? And then what is it to have a family? What do you fight for? And those are, again, I wouldn't call them dark themes. They're adult,
Adult.
mature
Mm-hmm.
themes. And I think that's the transition, because earlier we had adult themes, but they were quite dark around like absentee parents and
Mm-hmm.
suicide and things
Mm-hmm.
like that, versus this is very much about sort of growing up. But then it's handled with in this amazing tapestry of animation, something that I had never seen before. It's like amazing and
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. And then not to mention great voice work. Like he
Yeah,
hires
fantastic.
the topmost talent there is in Clooney and Meryl Streep, and
Mm-hmm.
gets these amazing performances from them, which is, for the record, really. So yeah, I love this one. But to me, Budapest is sort of the crown jewel of this phase, only because that's kind of what got me. I think
Yeah, yeah.
I touched on this a little bit earlier, which is that to me, that's a movie where the visual storytelling, the nuances of the art design, and the emotional storytelling is all sort of coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that obviously is in the screenplay and the direction, but also Ray Fiennes. I think I wish
Mm-hmm.
they will work again sometime
Me too.
together,
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
think he brings that sense of heart to this otherwise kind of quirky, odd character.
Mm-hmm.
This could have been played by Bill Murray and it would not be a warm person.
Correct.
But there's something about Ray Fiennes and this relationship between him and Zero is just so incredible. So I don't know. This is the movie where the art design and all the intricacies of the Russian doll miniature work is most in service of the story
Yes.
and its characters. And that's why I love it the most. I watched this one the most.
Yeah, this is your comfort movie. So we talked
Yeah.
about that in our comfort movie episode 28. So folks want to go back and hear us talk more about Budapest, that was in that episode. And I agree. I think the movie does really work. And each time I see it, I appreciate it a lot better. One just note before we move on to the final phase, we did not talk about Moonrise Kingdom, which personally is my least favorite of all of his
I've
films.
never seen that one.
It's never worked for me, though I know there's a lot of defenders, and
Right.
that film's sort of picking up a lot of steam online, at least, of like, oh, it's so underrated and really is one of his best. It's just not. I've seen it maybe a handful of times, and every time I'm just like, this just does absolutely nothing for me. So that's my least favorite of his films
Mm,
so far. I just wanted to make a note of that. So maybe
mm.
when you see it, you'll have a difference of opinion. We'll have to, maybe it'll come up in a future episode. So the final phase, which is the one we're in now, would be films like Isle of Dogs, French Dispatch, Asteroid City. This is again kind of piggybacking off of Grand Budapest in terms of, there's a lot of the Russian doll aesthetic, like you mentioned. It now expands back to more ensemble character sets as opposed to Grand Budapest, which is much about relationship between two people, which is what he's done in several of his movies. But now we're back to the Tenenbaums or the Zissou or these large swaths, even bigger than he has ever had. These all feel like ensemble pictures to me too. They're not
Mhm.
really about one single character. Hell, French Dispatch is actually a anthology film of a
Right.
bunch of short films put together. So it's very interesting, the phase that we're in now. I think I like these films more than I love them. I think I also haven't seen them a lot, maybe one or
Right.
two times each one of them at this point, because they're new, and also I haven't connected to them on the same level as the previous ones. But I think it's a very interesting period that he's in right now. What are your thoughts on these films?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a very interesting period. I think these movies are actually a lot deeper
Mm-hmm.
than what meets the eye, especially Asteroid City.
Yeah.
I think there's so much going on there. The narrative device, though I love it on an intellectual level of sort of a play in a play in a play sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing that's happening, it takes a bit for your heart to catch up,
Yes.
and I think
Yes.
that's sort of what holds one back. But I do think if I watch these movies more than once, I will fall in love with them. I think they'll probably have a lot of lasting impact. Once again, the production design, every single aspect technically is sort of at the highest level it can possibly be. I mean, he's
Mhm.
playing with different languages and shifting from black and white to color, and all sorts of things are happening. And like you mentioned, the ensembles are huge. It's
Mhm.
fun to see like new people come into his foray, because
Yeah,
he
yeah.
has sort of this company of actors. And I mentioned this, I think, in the Budapest episode, that to me, that's like the working dream, right? Like you have your company of people, they get to you, and every couple of years you call them and you say, hey, Jason, who and so, Tilda, do you want to come on board? And they all
Yeah.
show up and they have this great time. And it's fun to see him open his doors and have Tom Hanks join
Right.
that crew,
Yes. Yes.
or Margot Robbie in a scene or what have you. So I love that he's expanding his kind of repertory actory company. But yeah, there is a like love sort of gap here. But
I,
but
I
I do think the depth is much more, because these
yes.
are not just about a few people. They're about worlds, they're about societies that are in, either peril or decay, or just aging, or dealing with changing times, or dealing with UFOs and aliens, who can be a metaphor for anything that you want it
Right.
to be. So I think there's just a lot of deep stuff going on in these movies.
I agree. I think these movies are very complicated to kind of get at the core of the emotions. There's a lot of, yes, the visual aesthetics you can say are distracting, but I think also just in the way that he's touching on these themes, it's a lot harder to access than
Hmm.
his previous works, which were, especially the Owen Wilson co-written ones, I think wore their hearts in their sleeves a little bit more.
Yeah.
Now their heart is on a sleeve, but it's covered by an overcoat, a jacket, another jacket, like a rain slicker. Like there's so many different layers that he puts on that it's kind of hard to get at the heart of what some of these movies are. And I think that over time, as I break down these films, the more I watch them, I do think I will end up enjoying them a lot more than I do now, especially a film like Asteroid City. But they're harder to access. And I
Yeah.
do wonder too, I think these are also you talk about worlds in decay and changing times. I mean, all three of these films were post 2016. Sort of I think that presidential election in the United States did change a lot of things here. And I think Wes Anderson's sort of struggling with that a bit. I mean, these are films, all three of them, especially Isle of Dogs, but even French Dispatch and Asteroid City are very overtly political in their messaging, which
Mhm.
are themes that he has not really even touched upon or even glanced towards. I mean, maybe Grand Budapest a little bit, but not
Mhm.
really. But now he's full on in it. I mean, French Dispatch is a whole scene about, student riots in France that are political in
Mhm.
the 60s. Obviously, Isle of Dogs is a whole allegory for a lot of different things like racism, fascism, government control. And Asteroid City, I think, is there's a COVID commentary in that.
Right.
They have to be in quarantine and talk through windows like Zoom meetings or whatever. So there's a lot of things that he's dealing with that are just broader themes versus very, very personal and intimate themes that I think a lot of his early movies brought out. So it's just interesting to see him evolve like that as a filmmaker, even though his films, I think, are harder to access, at least on an
Yeah.
emotional level for me, even though I can appreciate the aesthetics.
Yeah, I agree. I think you just have to take time to take those jackets off
Yeah.
one at a
And
time.
yeah, and I don't mind working for a film in terms of
Totally.
getting at it. It makes them richer the more different times you tackle it, different times you choose to pick it up and watch it. You're a different person. You'll connect differently. The world's different. How does that kind of play into it? So I think it's almost like he's putting out a challenge for his hardcore fans like me to be like, these are the films. They're difficult, but there's rewarding. You just have to work at it a
Yeah,
little bit. And I'll put the work in. I just haven't done that yet.
totally. I agree. And I will say that they're still very personal. And that's the one thing I
Hmm.
love about him, is that, you know, the scale of the movie might change, the devices at play might change, but you can tell that each of these movies, they mean something to him personally. And if this is the frame of mind he's in, sort of trying to navigate political changes and the turmoil in our world and such, then it's sort of kind of humbling and also cathartic to see that he also feels those things and he's trying to process them through
Hmm.
these movies. Like none of these movies, I think, are made just for the heck of it.
Definitely not.
People might say that, oh, there's another Wes Anderson movie, all trying to be quirky so he can get his band of actors back together and put something, beautiful on screen with intricate stuff.
Hmm.
No, he's doing all this because he is drawn to certain themes. And like you said up front, he's trying to use the things that are in his control to
Hmm.
process that, which
Hmm.
I love that actually.
Me too. No, I really do too. Like using the techniques of film to try to control and then unlock
Yeah.
these emotions, which is something you can do in your own life too. I mean, there's certain things you're not a director, but there's certain things you can control about your life, and there's certain things that you can't. And it's using the things you can control to help you focus on the things that you can and understand those emotions, I think is important and therapeutic in a way. And that's I think shown through his films, especially those first three, which held very near and dear to my heart. I mean, they're some of my favorite films of all time and really did shape me in a lot of different ways. I mean, each one of those films could be in almost every episode we've
Yeah.
talked about so far for sure. Finally, we should just note that his next film, short film on Netflix, is coming out based on a Roald Dahl story. It's actually a first in a series that will have already dropped on Netflix by the time folks are listening, but not by the time recording. So we can't comment on that film or the set of Roald Dahl short films he has coming up. But Karan, what would you like to see him beyond those films do in the next part of his career?
It's an interesting and hard question because,
Mm-hmm.
like we said, we'll show up for whatever he does. And he's
Right.
just such a thoughtful artist that whatever he puts out, I'll be up for it. But just to kind of shake things up, I would actually love for him to go back and do something in the vein of Tannenbaums or Rushmore or Bottled Rocket that sort of is stripped down,
Mm-hmm.
and more about story, more about characters. I don't know if he can do that anymore because that's, just feels like Left Behind is on a different trajectory
Mm-hmm.
now. But just to shake things up, I would love for him to do something like that and maybe even try a different genre. Like there are all these memes about what if what would a Wes Anderson Western look like, or what would a
Mm-hmm.
Wes Anderson superhero movie look like, or what have you. So I don't know if he goes back to his kind of pure storytelling roots, maybe he takes up a different genre. What about a musical?
Yeah.
How cool would that be? Actually, a musical with all his intricate Russian doll stuff
Would
would
be
be amazing.
would be very cool. I'm trying to think, is he other than his there's been music sequences in the sense of especially during that needle drop period where there's like a montage where he's using the song and it definitely is very choreographed, but he hasn't really ever done a musical performance in any of his films unless I'm forgetting something major. I'm going back and just thinking, I don't think there's been even a sequence of like
Yeah.
someone singing or playing an instrument. I mean, yeah, in Zissou there was the guy playing the Bowie covers, but that was very different. That was more like a background thing. That would actually be really fun. I was actually thinking that less for me about the stripped down nature of it, but that I just love, like I've mentioned earlier in this episode, just him to get back together with Owen as a screenwriting partner, and whatever the visuals that he decides to come up with or how he decides to put that project together, what that is. I think that is a partnership. Again, those three films that they did together are some of my favorite movies of all time. And I wonder what they would do now, even if just one thing to work together. And I also wonder too, as he's been very successful actually in playing in a lot of different mediums. I mean, speaking of these Netflix shorts he has coming up, he's done short films before. There was the one that was tied to Darjeeling Limited that I really like. He's done a lot of great commercial work that I think they're very fun commercials that are also do tell a story, have as good aesthetic there. And I wonder what he would do with a TV series, 10 episode
Mhm.
prestige thing. Maybe it's just a one season type of mini series, kind of expanding on what he's been doing with things like the not only the short Netflix movies that he was doing, but things like French Dispatch. It's an anthology film. What if that was just expand a little bit? I just wonder what he would do with a longer narrative and just play around with the form a bit. I mean, obviously his aesthetics would still be there, but I just wonder what he would do in that type of environment on TV. I just think would be an interesting path for him to take. But I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever do that beyond the commercials and short films, but we'll see, I guess, right?
Yeah, that would be interesting. Although selfishly, I want him to make movies because I think
Sure, sure,
I
sure.
want him to
Right.
stay pure to this form and this format, and then like we both said, like the joy of watching all of his artistry on the big screen is sort of unparalleled, and I almost don't want to taint that because once you
Mm.
watched it at home, and it'll be very interesting after this Netflix movie. This has never happened before, right? Like his stuff just dropped on Netflix
Hmm.
as it came out. So I'm curious what that does and how that makes me feel.
No, I get what you mean about the larger canvas, and it's also really fun. Like when I saw Asteroid City opening weekend, I think it was even in limited release in LA. I mean, the theater was totally packed. It's
Mm-hmm.
like he has hardcore Anderson fans that are there, and there's definitely that fun social aspect to it. But I see it more as a challenge.
I know
right?
what you
Each
mean.
medium is a bit of a challenge. Even if he would do a stage play or something, like I wonder what that would sort of be like. He is so talented that I think he could take those talents to different mediums. But for me, it's mainly about working with Owen would be a great thing. We'll see. Okay, well, thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed our first journey down a path of filmography of a director. Like we said in the beginning, we'll do actors, directors, writers, who knows in the future. But right now we're talking Wes because of his shorts that's come out. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. And then if you're not subscribed to our podcast, you do so on your podcast platform of choice. We're also on YouTube where you can listen to individual reviews of our movies. Make sure to also rate us or leave a review because that helps folks find what we are up to here. So with that said, Karan, see you at the next Wes Anderson movie.
I'll see you there in my tweed jacket and in my bicycle made of tuba parts.